don't just think of schema markup for visibility, think of it as your data layer and a way to kind of engage across your enterprise in order to make a difference in sort of how you show up and are understood by AI. I'm Martha van Berkel, and this is SEO in 2026.
Martha, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
SEO is now about managing your data layer for AI.
So what is your data layer for AI?
So we really have to think about the data we're putting kind of into the machine, right? And most people think of schema markup still as sort of like trying to get just visibility, but it's way more than that. By actually doing semantic schema markup, you're building this thing called a knowledge graph. And that can be this contextual kind of thing that allows machines to understand. And so I want to talk a little bit and share sort of like why SEOs need to think beyond just like doing it for search visibility and more about sort of it being the input, the thing that we're doing to control brand and understanding for large language models.
Right, okay. So does this need to be done for every page in your website, or are you only talking about specific pages here?
No, I think we think of the website more as a system now, right? So, like the websites are sort of elements of that content that you're putting into the machine, but you really want to use schema markup and define relationships between those pieces of content and between different entities or topics on the site. And it's really that connectedness that then becomes really powerful. So, again, you can't just think about optimizing, a page. You want to be thinking of like that much bigger connected data layer, right? Which, in my words, I usually talk about as that knowledge graph.
And are you also talking about trying to connect the data layer of your brand appearing on other websites out there, or are you just solely talking about on your own website here?
Yeah, I think of like primarily, think of like backlinks or interlinking within your website. Would it be how we talked about it previously in the SEO world? Now I want to like think about how we're connecting those dots, but the important thing here is context, right? So when we're doing sort of interlinking between our sites or even backlinks to other sites or to referencing things, we're not providing context. And the context is really sort of what is the relationship between something. So to use an example in schema, like it might be, the page is about a product and I'm talking, I'm connecting or bringing context that this product is offered by this brand. Or I might be bringing context that it has like these other related products to it, or that it might sort of play in this, like solve a specific problem, sort of, and I want to kind of define that problem or maybe that kind of industry area or that category. And so it's really when you provide the specifics around not just like that it's connected, but that there's sort of relationships and context in that connection. And why the connection is important is that sort of large language models, like they need to understand those relationships to do accurate inferencing. And there's a ton of research around knowledge graphs. In fact, Gartner, when they released recently, like their hype cycle for AI, sort of has kind of gone up. All the generative AI things we've been talking about, it's kind of come down, it's coming back up. One of the technologies on this like 2025 hype cycle that we need to be thinking about is knowledge graphs. And it's because of the power that they have in helping large language models with their biggest problems.
Okay, so are you saying that if you consistently deliver a more consistent, correct schema on your website, you'll be building a better knowledge graph, and then LLMs will be more likely to trust you in the future?
That's right. It helps solve, like we've seen it actually like solve very specific hallucinations. And then it also will help solve sort of like brand understanding. So I like to think of it as like, it's still going to help with the visibility in the pieces on the SEO side from content teams. Like you'll also be able to kind of have better understanding on coverage of entities and topics. We'll talk about that. And then the third piece is like, again, that brand understanding, that brand authority.
So maybe when you onboard a client, maybe for the first time, what's typical in terms of the areas of their website that are more likely to be misunderstood by search engines?
Yeah, what we're finding is that, like, often if there's something else on the web that's talking about it. So, for example, this one client, we saw that there was an article talking about a location being closed. And what was so interesting was the location wasn't closed. It was talking about an article about a time that they, had done a repair in the office. But for some reason, that website was getting higher authority than the brand itself. And so that was just an example where they hadn't, optimized or put schema markup on that location page. Once they did, connected it directly to the brand, we actually saw that that became the authority for that answer and that question that was being done. So sometimes it's like if other things exist sort of that are providing a different answer, that are perhaps wrong, not owned by the brand, but connected to the brand or where the LLM's sort of looking at it. In this case, it was coming from a news site versus sort of like what the brand itself has.
So why do LLMs love knowledge graphs?
Well, I think it comes back to this sort of like being able to do accurate inferencing. And often people, if they've seen me speak, I talk about sort of my connection to Kevin Bacon, right? So I had a car, my car was in the movie by Kevin Bacon. Kevin Bacon directed the movie, and Kevin Bacon used to drive my car. So then you can infer that you can win the Kevin Bacon game because those relationships are explicitly understood. So again, if our brains, right, which LLMs are started doing that logic, and that logic to kind of jump along, data points that they have. The same thing goes with knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs are really just allowing, contextual relationships to be defined in the data. And so that's like why it has confidence in the data and that inferencing. And so when we think again about sort of, there is still sort of, we could probably do a whole other show on just like how, LLMs are doing vectors sort of on a site, but the vectors aren't accurate. The vectors aren't grounded in truth and in data and relationships. And that's why it's so different.
And how does a brand get to know the information that is contained about them within a knowledge graph?
Good question. I like to think more about like, what is it known for? So like if we think about, everyone's talked about entity SEO. I like to think of, entities. A lot of content marketers and marketers think of those like as topics or things. And so what's really interesting is that when you do schema markup and you also start sort of adding entity relationships in them. So often we talk about external entities and internal entities. So external entities would be sort of like where you're defining something like with a Wikipedia or a Google Knowledge Graph reference. An internal entity would be like, what is the thing I'm talking about on my site? So on a brand, it might be like their products, their services, their people, pillar pages that are talking about something that they're experts in. What's really interesting is that when you put that in the schema markup, you can start asking the knowledge graph questions to say, like, what are the topics or entities that I'm speaking a lot about? And then you can start inferring or asking questions around, well, what are the topics? So if you know the topic and the related entities, you can start asking, like, well, what topics am I an authority on? And I think in this world where there's, I'll say, like murkiness or sort of, I call it like the dark funnel, where there's lots of things we can't measure. The thing that the brands can control is like, again, what they're putting into the machine, like what they're putting in the schema. And so are we talking about the right topics and entities? Is our content actually talking about those things so that they can then sort of infer, figure out like what other content they need to build in order to put it in. So sort of different answer to your question, David, and sort of like, it's understanding what I'm talking about in my graph. You can also query graphs. So at Schema app, we're just about to launch our MCP server so people can query their graph and connect it to other kind of AI initiatives. And then, Sparkle queries is sort of a way people historically, in the knowledge graph or semantic technology community that you would actually like do a query. But I think, MCP and some of these new sort of AI standards for kind of querying information or connecting agents to information will make it more accessible and sort of more powerful, whether that be internal initiatives or external agents as we see those evolve.
So, talking about measuring, you say that brands can measure what they put into the machine. Can brands also measure what they get out of the machine in terms of increased brand exposure and more content displayed within the LLM search results?
Well, as I'm sure others have talked about, like there is sort of things we can measure today and things we can't. So, while Google, I think, does a good job sort of, well, the impressions, clicks, AIO citations, like those are relatively easy to measure. I think the harder pieces are right now with ChatGPT. So there's lots of new companies coming out sort of measuring brand authority with regards to prompts. I do think it's sort of a directional measure versus an actual measure, since the prompts that they're using in order to pull those numbers typically are way shorter than what we're seeing sort of are the standard prompts. I don't know about you, David, but like I write super long prompts with lots of context, lots of questions, asking me for clarification before I'm looking for sort of it to provide me research. So I think part of it is we're in a wait and see mode to see sort of how that is. The best measure is conversions on your website and traffic, mostly because then you can see it, but you're not going to see some of those interactions and sort of answers that are being done sort of in the web or sort of in areas that are providing service is a little bit how I like to describe it, since AI chatbots. There's so many different of them, and I think we're going to see them verticalized to where we won't see that initial interaction. We'll just see engagement lower in the funnel.
There's so much, as you've shared, that you can unlock by displaying more content in these types of results. And there are different types of multimodal search results that you can experience as well. How do you know what type of search result that you're targeting in terms of what's best for different queries, but also where your queries going to display? Is there any research that you can do in order to actually best determine what type of content to be publishing on your website to begin with?
So I think it's sort of the old world of like keywords, but thinking kind of broader than that and sort of like the entities. And then I would say like the data you do have around like how you're performing on AIO, which is still in Google Search Console, sort of tying back to queries, right? People are looking at. I think I would go back to first principles, more about sort of the brand really trying to figure out, I said, with lack of information from ChatGPT on like what's actually performing, to be like, what does the brand need to drive for the business with regards to the things that it needs to convert and be known for? So it kind of goes back to sort of brand strategy and actually even content strategy on sort of what are the entities or topics that you really want to be known for, making sure you have coverage. And then as these new metrics come up beyond, again, kind of brand citations, AIO citations that give us more specificity, it'll allow us to know it. But again, the piece that we're working a lot with our enterprise on is like, how is the brand? Is it actually talking and have the content that allows them to be an authority on the things that they want to show up? And then when we finally get accurate measures from the chat GPTs, which again is like the biggest kind of platform out there right now in sort of the AI platform space, it'll give us, I think, more continuity on sort of like what interactions or what topics and things are people actually asking about that will then allow us to have grounded data to then put it back to it. But I think right now I'm encouraging brands to just go back to basics, looking at, what is it indeed their customers are looking for and what they're trying to sell, and then making sure they have great coverage on that.
Yeah, there's two different trains of thought, I guess, in terms of what a brand should represent, and it's what you want to be known as a brand, but it's also, I guess, what your target customers are likely to be looking for and going to resonate with when they're looking for that type of brand. How do you try to ensure that you're covering all bases without covering too many things?
I think it's an iterative approach, frankly, right? So it's like, it's most business owners like it's like, well, what are we people engaging with today? And what do we want them to engage with, right? Like when you see sales in certain areas not going, you go back to basics, right? Ask customers that have bought it today, why they bought it, what problems they're solving, et cetera. And it really is, I would say, like this, beautiful piece around, marketing, content, SEO, all working really hand in hand. And so, well, my piece that I look at is like, is the data that's derived from the content talking about the things that customers like want to look for or are looking for? I really see, and we've seen elevated engagement and cross-functional work across brands where SEOs, because they have the data, because they can actually look at entity coverage, they can look at saying like what parts of the sites are actually optimized. They can then go and say, we have big gaps in this play. And so content can now use that data, kind of build that data. And then that goes back to like, is marketing like seeing the leads come in on the areas that they want? So we're seeing, I'll say, more cross-functional work ever, sort of as these things come together, driven by sort of AI coming out, which I think is really cool.
Great. Yeah. So you're talking about cross-functional work. You're talking about marketing, content, SEO. Firstly, should SEO be leading this? And secondly, if SEO is conducting training sessions internally, what does an SEO 101 training session internally actually look like nowadays?
I heard one of my customers say, I'm so glad that I now have this language to talk about entity coverage and sort of entity authority so that I can go to content teams and have data to support the recommendations that I've been making to the business before. So I think, SEO now, I talked about this, in the past, which is like, I think they're the hero now. Like they can kind of translate what may have been like nerdy, kind of technical SEO pieces and now educate about, again, this is what needs to be in the data. The data is derived from content. This is like what we need to build in the content. And then this is what supports like overall strategy. So it's like that dot connecting that, if SEOs can make those leaps and kind of explain it in those different ways, I think will really make them have a seat at the table more than ever.
Martha, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
don't just think of schema markup for visibility, think of it as your data layer and a way to kind of engage across your enterprise in order to make a difference in sort of how you show up and are understood by AI.
Martha van Berkel is CEO at Schema App. Find out more over at schemaapp.com. Martha, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thanks for having me.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at seoin2026.com.